contractor labor and often defines the materials and types of construction processes best suited for the project. This being the primary means and methods power vested within the contractor's ambit. More foundationally, if we think about architecture as a profession and an intellectual pursuit, which I would posit as the normative way of thinking about architecture, that we engage in the long history of conceptualizing the field outside the labor of its production. Jacob asked if you wanted to hear some Alberti. I'm not going to ask, I'm just going to give it to you. But so this is not exactly a new thing. Vitruvius, writing in the first and oldest known treatise on architecture, made a distinction between fabrica and ratiocinato, where fabrica refers to the practice of building and ratiocinatio refers to the reasoning, the ideation of the building before its realization. Architecture in the Vitruvian sense was a rational act, aligned with geometry and rhetoric, and theorized as distinct and superior to the craft of building. And Alberti, who writes, I should explain, quote, I should explain whom I mean by an architect, for it is no carpenter that I would have you to compare to the greatest exponents of other disciplines. The carpenter is but a mere instrument in the hands of the architect, unquote. Like Vitruvius, Alberti links architecture to intellect and creativity, to history, beauty, and drawings, and not the dirt and sweat of labor. And so with that very quick foundation, how can we think about strategies for change? One answer is to adjust curricula and what we include in architecture education, work that is being done in schools around the world and is something this conference will hopefully contribute to. And quite often in classrooms and lecture halls, the first question asked when presented with the complicated entanglements of architecture and labor is something like, what can architects do, considering the very real professional, legal, and political forces working against fair labor? Or the more nihilist, but also more or less true, that was referenced in the Pit of Despair? Isn't this just capitalism doing what capitalism does? And both of these responses share a similar origin point in the economic and free trade systems that have been globally dominant for decades. Systems that, as we anxiously watch, are being dismantled in real time, the effects of which is anyone's guess, but as of yet, I have not seen any evidence that a resurgence in fair labor is likely to be one of the outcomes. There are many ways to think about affecting change in the architecture supply chain through the lens of social change. And in fact, there are whole discourses in the social sciences investigating the use and effectiveness of particular models. But for this discussion, I want to propose three different broadly conceived categories for change that may present hopeful avenues for consideration and discussion, each of which comes from a discourse or movement directly related to what we have been trying to achieve. And what is important here in terms of how to think through these broad categories is not necessarily how each is different from the other, but how each actually requires methods from the others to be productive. And I would also invite some of the guests that are coming up later, if they have additional thoughts from a different perspective, to please share. Okay. The first is a consumer model, often called consumer activism, which can be also referred to as corporate reform, but also reform within the industry or profession. Lawrence Glickman, the leading historian of consumer activism, defines it as, quote, organized consumption, or more often non-consumption, that is collective, oriented towards the public sphere, grassroots, and conscious of the political impact of print and commerce, end quote. One example of successful consumer-oriented change was sweatshop activism in the mid-1990s, which mobilized around similar conditions we are looking at in the architectural supply chain. Andrew Ross states they were, quote, a showcase of horrors for the labor abuses sanctioned by the global free trade economy where child labor, wage slavery, and employer cruelty are legion, unquote. Global awareness of sweatshop conditions was largely instigated by the National Labor Committee and their investigations and activism. Often publicity wins and a feature in 60 Minutes, NLC moved to a more public name and shame strategy highlighting labor conditions in factories making clothing for the Gap and others. They were also instrumental in uncovering child labor in Kathy Lee Gifford's clothing factories that was sold at Kmart. And from there, student protests at universities, other name and shame campaigns, including Guess, Nike, and Levi's, shed light on the fact that much of the garment industry used forced labor, and often that of children. Facing large consumer backlash and broadly based, well-organized union resistance, some large companies made lasting changes to their manufacturing and labor processes, if not the supply chain. This history is complex and nuanced, but the end result was a notable change in the way that some of the industry operates. And to this day, there are companies such as Patagonia, who's been referenced already, and Everlane that highlight the working conditions in their factories as part of their brand and marketing strategy. If the similarities between architecture, supply chain, and garment production are discernible, the differences are also worth noting. The sweatshop movement started at an organization and union action, but it quickly led to consumer activism. The fact that Michael Jordan earned more in endorsements from Nike than did the entire Indonesian workforce that made his shoes was a concrete example of how labor exploitation creates immense wealth. Unfortunately for us, architecture production does not operate on the same consumer model. Who consumes architecture? The client, the user, the city? Even if the answer is yes to all of these groups, how much pressure can they put on the design and construction of a building in a way consumer boycotts and name and shame movements can? We have seen the boycotting architecture does not work, and many of the world's most known architects have proven ambivalent about the working conditions on their own job sites, let alone the long supply chain. But the thing I'd focus on is not that the sweatshop campaign was successful to the extent that it was due to consumer action, but that consumer action came after organizing work, union work, local activists, advocating for their own workplace improvements. The second model I would point to is an enforcement-based model, meaning regulations over the use of goods and services produced through enforced and otherwise unfair labor standards by organizations and governments. Like the history of sweatshop advocacy and other consumer-forward organizing efforts, the landscape of legislation and governmental policy of forced labor is vast. It's quickly worth noting the United Kingdom's Modern Slavery Act of 2015. The act primarily focused on anti-trafficking and forced labor in the UK, but before the law was passed, a supply chain amendment was added. While the profile of trafficking and supply chain labor was raised, a report issued by the House of Lords last year acknowledged the law's reporting mechanisms, quote, do not mandate what a statement should contain, and there is little provision for enforcement. Oops. In the United States, there have been several efforts at several scales. At the state level, California passed the California Transparency and Supply Act in 2010. A consumer-oriented law, the legislation does not technically ban the sale of products produced through forced labor, but asks companies to disclose supply chain labor practices, allowing consumers to make their own choice. And like in the UK, the success of the California law has been decidedly mixed. One reason is that any coalition fighting for workers are also fighting against corporate interests who are themselves working for their own governance goals. And at the federal level, supply chain labor is regulated primarily through Section 307 of the Tariff Act of 1930 and the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. Again, these laws, and there's many, many more, are far too complex and detailed to properly adjudicate here, especially for me. But it's worth noting a RAND report that was just released this last year that states the overall enforcement of supply chain legislation depends to a great deal on stakeholder action and coordination, meaning enforcement heavily relies on corporations designing, producing, and importing goods, non-governmental organizations and researchers advocating for systemic change, and interested consumers. The conclusion RAND makes is that the Department of Homeland Security, while making inroads in tariff enforcement and border enforcement and in the goods produced in certain areas of China, that the entities charged with enforcing supply chain regulation lack information, resources, funding, and staff to properly enforce the laws as written. That said, one aspect that does seem to be working, if at a fairly still small and rather abstract scale, is the supply chain traceability matrix, which is the product of the Tracing and Engagement Methodologies project funded by the Department of Labor and implemented by Verite, who we'll hear more from. Verite is an important actor in the supply chain tracing, and I would locate their efforts as a sort of hybrid enforcement and consumer model. They work with both governments and corporations to ensure their supply chains adhere to jurisdiction rules and their own fair labor goals. The matrix is interesting for architectural supply chains in that it is broken down by industry. So you can look at bricks or glass and see both the upstream and downstream implications of each material production. Verite also works directly with corporate clients such as Patagonia, again, and Apple. For Patagonia, they have created a tiered supply chain and labor accountability structure beyond the immediate cut and sew factory that includes investigating migrant labor and conditions in fabric mills, and beyond that, ostensibly would be enforcing corporate labor standards at extraction sites. So I'd call these efforts hybrid in that corporations and producers are brought into coalition to change production standards, if not enforcement mechanisms. And another important hybrid model is LEAD, mentioned already today several times. An initiative here that most of us are familiar with. LEAD starts with the founding of the U.S. Green Building Council in 1993 by a real estate developer, an environmental lawyer, a marketing executive, and together with a scientist from the National Resource Defense Council, a solar panel entrepreneur, a former Florida governor, architects, engineers, and builders, the USGBC published the first version of LEAD in 1998. And the latest version, LEAD 5, shall be released at any moment. This is not the space to litigate the success of LEAD, the USGBC, or even the broader goals of sustainability, regardless of the definition. Many of us are pretty well familiar with the critiques, but I do think it's worth understanding how LEAD operates. At its most basic level, LEAD is an accreditation system. You can be individually accredited by taking exams, proving you know and understand the contours of sustainable building practices. And your projects can be accredited. You could submit the project to be analyzed against LEED standards and awarded credits based on material choice, systems efficiency, siting and environmental location, transportation, interface, etc. Different project types have specific metrics, with the goal being LEED certification. The USGBC, as an umbrella organization, also supports legislation and has championed the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law. LEED requirements are mandated in many governmental and public works contracts, and by and large, LEED has become the standard by which sustainability is discussed and implemented. And beyond LEED, the USGBC has initiatives focused on energy, infrastructure, waste, parking, landscape, and user wellness. So if we diagram it out, LEED and USGBC link practitioners, clients, contractors, governments, and policy into a certification framework that has produced new design practices. The resulting buildings produced by LEED certification are often granted subsidies, giving everyone concrete goals and valuable marketing and branding credentials. But what LEED does not do is have much to say about human sustainability. And as of now, issues of pay, labor, and social equity are contained within a few pilot credits, and hopefully that will change in their new versions. So I will close here with the third way forward, and I'm almost done, which is neither a negation of either the more corporatist or governance models, but a combination expansion of both. A broader collective action-based model, or more specifically, since we're talking about enforced labor and modern-day slavery, an abolitionist model. This would mean broadening the list of stakeholders in a project to include the labor that goes into designing, building, and manufacturing the parts and materials of an architectural project. And this is the hard part, to find and integrate those voices into the process. Ruth Wilson Gilmore writes that the abolition is not an absence, but a presence. And so as architects, as people trained with imagining presence in the world, we are uniquely apt at working together to forge a more equitable built environment. Thank you.
All right, I would like to ask our next speakers to both come up because we're going to do a little bit different of a format. We're going to do some quick interventions, and then we're going to have a bit of a conversation with them. So if you guys can be like pre-positioned at the table. And very quick bios. So what's that? Because I'm the one that is doing the intro, and I have the power, and I want to tell stories about you. So Greg Asbed here is co-founder of Coalition Immokalee Workers, which you've heard a little bit already. Somebody who I've worked with for just a few years since when we started doing these cases together. He's a recipient of a number of interesting things, including the MacArthur Fellowship. But more importantly, he continues to go out and work in the fields with the other workers, and he can throw a good couple of tons of watermelons 18 feet up in the air into the back of a semi-trailer when it maybe not as much as he used to, but he puts his money where his mouth is as far as the work is concerned. So too, Alicia Lay, who's a senior programs officer for the Survivor Alliance, which is the global movement of trafficking survivors who are bringing their skills and experiences to the fight. And we were very lucky to have Alicia join us for the class in Michigan. She is a Michigander at this point, and she is a go-to consultant for folks in the United States and otherwise on forced labor, sex trafficking, survivor leadership, and the fight against all forms of exploitation. So we're going to do a couple of quick interventions from each of you, and then we're going to do a bit of a conversation. So I think we have, did they tee you up first? Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. That's what we do where we're from. I don't know how you all do it, but I'm told to look for a cursor to do something that would be nice to do for you today at this hour.
You want the video?
Yeah.
Trevor, can you play the video?
Because there ain't no cursor on this table. Anyway, yeah, we're going to be doing a much shorter presentation, at least an hour today, and then hopefully we'll have more time for question and answer. A large part of mine will be this 5-minute video.
5:30 a.m. in Immokalee, Florida. It's a dark morning under an overcast sky as Alejandrina Carrera begins the 40-minute walk to her sister's house to drop off her 2 small children. It's too early for them to go to school, and they're too young to stay home alone. But Alejandrina has a bus to catch. Every day, hundreds of migrant farm workers, like Alejandrina, come to this parking lot in the center of town, where they board old school buses that take them to the fields. Hey! Alejandrina picks tomatoes on a farm about 30 minutes away. She likes her job now, says she's treated with respect. But it wasn't always that way. Alejandrina came to Immokalee from Mexico more than 20 years ago. She was alone, just 14 years old, small, scared, and extremely vulnerable. She says it didn't take long for someone to take advantage of her. It happened at one of the first farms she worked at. She says her boss promised her a better job in a warehouse. But as soon as she got in his truck, he drove to a remote part of the farm, and she knew she was in trouble.
Y el Señor me dice, si no haces por las buenas.
He told me if we don't do this the easy way, we'll do it the hard way. I was afraid and trembling. He tried to abuse me sexually, but he didn't get to because another worker heard me screaming and came to help me. The next day, the boss fired us both.
Agricultural workers are without a doubt the most vulnerable workers in the United States, and I would say across the world.
John S. Forms is co-owner of Sunripe Certified Brands, where Alejandrina works today.
Let's talk about reality here. This is farming. This is agriculture. Agriculture has, from the very early days of man farming and needing to have work, has been full of opportunities for abuse.
His family-owned farm is one of the largest in the U.S. and was the first to join the Fair Food Program, an innovative initiative that has been held up as the most comprehensive social responsibility program in U.S. agriculture. Today, nearly every farm in Florida has signed on. The program combines a set of high standards that includes monitoring the farms and educating the workers.
Buenos días.
Leonel Perez works for the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, or CIW, a nonprofit organization that developed the Fair Food Program. Today, CIW is holding a training session with farm workers, teaching them not only what rights they have, but what to do when those rights are violated. Leonel and the other educators here have first-hand knowledge because they are all former migrant farm workers themselves.
Y lo más importante,
The most important thing for me is to be able to talk to other workers because I have a shared experience. I work in the fields too, and now we can work together to end worker abuse.
The Fair Food Program works because it has market consequences. If a farm violates the code of conduct, it is suspended from the program and cannot sell to participating buyers, which includes some of the biggest fast food restaurants and grocery stores. It all makes a big difference for those at the bottom of the supply chain, like Alejandrina.
Voy a trabajar libremente, ya no
You can work freely. You're not going to be harassed. You're not going to be insulted. You're not going to be forced to work. There's more respect now.
These days, Alejandrina wakes up in the morning happy to come to work, proud to talk to her kids about the company she works for. And that, she says, is the biggest change of all. Amra Walker, CNN.
All right. So I'm going to boil down the 15-minute presentation I had into about 2-3 minutes, and just really touch on the two key points that you can take away from that video, and then maybe touch briefly on the structure that you see there. That is the unique structure of the Fair Food Program. The two most important things to take from what you just saw is the Fair Food Program's unique success in stopping long-standing violations, ranging from the kind of sexual assault that you saw occurred to 14-year-old Alejandrina in the fields the day she came to the United States to work in the field, to any number of forced labor operations that Lou and Laura Germino, who's here, a longtime colleague of mine with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, we worked together to prosecute dozens of farm labor bosses and put them behind bars for forced labor operations that they were responsible for. And even beyond the fields, beyond Florida, beyond agriculture, there was mention of Bangladesh and the Rana Plaza factory collapse earlier. That as well, this same model has been able to stop those factory collapses from happening since 2013. The reason for that unique success is due to the program's unique structure. It's that simple. The way this program was put together, which should appeal to people who put things together for a living, or at least design things for a living, is the reason why it is so successful on the ground, right? And the second point that's important to understand, it's essential to understand, is that the reason for that unique structure is because of the unique architects who designed it, who envisioned it, designed it, built it, and run it. And those architects are the very humans whose human rights are in question in this human rights protection model, right? Workers. They are the workers. The Coalition of Immokalee Workers designed that blueprint, if I can borrow a term, right there. And ultimately, I don't know if this is true or not, but if I were an architect, it would be my dream to design and build and live in my own home and have my family make its life inside a home that I created, that I envisioned, that I designed, together with the rest of my family. And that's what this is. That must be the best home. For me, would be the best home. And for workers, this is the best home because it protects them from everything that had existed for decades, for generations in the fields. So I'll leave it at that for right now. I think that's probably my time, right? And then Lisa, you got the rest, and then we'll take questions and that.
Thank you, Greg. Thanks, Phil. Thank you, Lou, for the invitation to come. I was joking with Greg, I don't know, you guys needed like some bleeding heart, social activist, nonprofit vibes in the space or what, but never did I think I would find myself talking to some really smart people in construction and architecture, but here we are. So yesterday I had the opportunity to land and take a walking tour of Yale and found myself listening to a special topic tour on the history of slavery. Has anyone done this walking tour? One of the guys speaking earlier, his face was on here. And a really powerful woman, Adrienne Joy Burns, who was a member of the Yale and Slavery Research Project, said this of why this work is important. And this is what she said. She said, the story is no longer on a group of white people who were saviors. It's on the enslaved people who actually built Connecticut Hall. It's on all of the black people who tried to become the first students and were not able to. And it's on the early black students who persevered, became successful, and contributed to society. And I thought that's the vision of when we talk about survivor engagement and engaging survivors in meaningful ways in this work. That's the vision, right? Because when we look at the abolitionist movement of chattel slavery, there was a rewriting of history that needed to be done, that it wasn't people from outside of that movement that fought for the rights. It was the people inside who had experienced the exploitation, who had experienced slavery and rising up and gaining that empowerment themselves to do that work. And so when asked to share about current methodology that could be helpful to the building industry on the cusp of this conversation that you are having today, to enact change, my advice would be to include those people, just as Greg said, who this is their experience themselves. And I'm going to share, this is a spectrum of ways to do that. I'm going to share 3 examples. There are examples all over the world of survivors who are leading and engaging change within their local communities. I can't highlight them all, obviously, but 3 quick examples that I've seen around the world, specifically in the area of architecture and construction. One is the Isra Institute in Thailand. They work and they connect workers, communities of businesses for sustainable supply chains. They're using technology to let worker voice drive change in partnership with very large global brands, where they're detecting and remediating cases. Over the last 3 years, they've remediated 150,000 cases. And that's all survivor-led, doing this work. Also, working with a project personally in India on the brick kiln project, where a huge exploitation in bricks. We won't get into that. You guys probably already know, but Volunteers for Social Justice from Punjab are working with a Society for Technology in Action and the University of Nottingham, who are creating tech solutions to track migration across brick kiln workers and advocate for change, influence around the bonded labor, but also around payment and the way that brick kiln workers are paid for 1,000 bricks per family and the child labor that's in charge of that. And then also just another creative solution, me personally working with the School of Architecture at Kent State University, my alma mater, go Flashes, who were working on projects around creating healing-centered built architecture. And what does it look like for people who have experienced long-term pervasive trauma or complex trauma as we enter into literally spaces? So there are partnerships that are happening. And one of the things that when we talk about in my encouragement that we do this work is how we do the work. So at my place of employment, Survivor Alliance, which is a global movement building organization. We have over 1,400 members across 44 countries of survivors, is that we advocate for survivors to be in this work. This is what we do. We do professional capacity building, personal capacity building. And one thing that we found is once survivors really got into the sector, specifically in the US, into the anti-trafficking work sector, is that it didn't go so well at the beginning. And what we found, I don't know if you guys know this, but our workplaces are still highly colonized, right? With ideologies and historical colonial structures that still shape the way that we do work. And so part of what we do at Survivor Alliance is work with organizations to understand what practices lead to inequities, marginalization, that still are prioritizing Eurocentric viewpoints, hierarchical, patriarchal systems, right? The extractive approach to labor. I don't know if how you guys work really feels that way, right? But I work in the anti-trafficking sector, and we're trying to undo even the way and the how we do that work. And so we have to do that as well. And then lastly, if you want to empower survivor voice and you don't have lived experience personally, right, the call is to really engage this idea of allyship. And an ally is someone who recognizes that you are on the privileged side of a particular prejudice and or oppression or divide that's created by society, and you actively engage in implementation or a strategy to dismantle that divide, right? And that really is what it takes if the building industry, right, wants to engage worker voice, survivor voice. The charge is, if you want to lean into this methodology, right, is to use your power for good. Share your power and knowledge and resources with those who have that lived experience, and then eventually be willing to give your power away so that people who have experienced exploitation can give it back to their communities of other people who are most effective.
So I want to tee up a quick question that comes out of, I think, both of your interventions. So Dr. Min Dang, who a number of us have worked with over the years, and Alicia, you're working with her as the head of the Survivor Alliance. So Dr. Dang has posited that survivor knowledge needs to be recognized as a new analytical form. And that if we are able to look at kind of an epistemology of survivor knowledge and then incorporate that into anti-slavery interventions, and to not go ahead with its anti-slavery interventions unless we have actually done that. Whether in policy spaces, work sites, standard setting, service provision, how have each of you seen the benefits of worker and survivor input play out? Your work on this even predates Min's publishing on this. But based on her insights and your own work, how have you seen that play out? Whichever of you would like to
start. It's interesting. Okay, it's always good to be in the entire day of a conference like this, because you can hear what other people are thinking and get ideas from what was said and bounce your thinking off that thinking. And speaking of thinking, there was a comment about slavery as an unthinking element in the built environment, or in our case, in the supply chain, right? And that hit me in my mind, because first of all, we think about it all the time, but second of all, I totally agree with it on one level, and I totally disagree on another level. So the level that I agree with it on is at the top of the supply chain, which is where the dominant paradigm for social responsibility was born, right? It was born in response to the threats, the reputational harm that was caused by the exposure of abuses in the 1990s and that sort of thing, starting at that point about 30 years ago. And so all this sort of, well, we have a code of conduct, and now we have auditors, and so we're doing our due diligence in order to do what we can do. And it was born out of the need to quell the public relations crises that were developed, that emerged from these human rights crises at the bottom of the supply chain, right? But when they were developing this, they weren't thinking about slavery. It's out of sight, out of mind is the way to understand that. In their case, the people at the top don't think about that. They just think about what they're feeling, which is fear of, stock price or fear of loss of sales or whatever as a result of that reputational harm. So I agree. That's exactly the reason why the dominant paradigm for corporate social responsibility today does not work and has been declared not fit for purpose by any number of studies, right? But where I disagree is that at the bottom of that exact same supply chain, where people throw melons all day long, 30-pound melons, and thousands of 30-pound melons all day long from 7 o'clock in the morning till 7 at night, and sometimes do that in a form of forced labor, where they are pushed to work past human exhaustion. They're working under 100 to 110 degrees heat, and they may not be given water when they need it. They're certainly not given shade, and they may not get their pay at the end of the week. And if they complain about that, they may be beaten. Those people are thinking about slavery every single moment of every single day, because you cannot pick up a melon and throw it without thinking about how the fuck am I doing this without getting paid for it. So that divide actually explains why CSR is a failed and dying paradigm. And WSR, which is actually created by the people who think about slavery every day and who think, if I have an opportunity to actually stop these things from happening, how am I going to do it? How am I going to make sure that that actually happens? How am I going to make sure that I will always get paid and I will not get beaten and that women will not be assaulted every day in the fields? And so they create systems like the one you saw earlier that is a wall-to-wall, 24/7 monitoring and enforcement system to ensure those things are not just remedied when they happen, but are prevented. Like when we did all the prosecutions, that was great, but not sufficient, because prosecutions just kept coming up. I think it was you who said you can't prosecute your way out of slavery, right? Prevention is the gold standard. And prevention requires a change of economic incentives in the industry. It needs the messaging has to change, and that's what workers create when they know that they have to stop this stuff and they have the opportunity to do it. But when you give the very top of the supply chain that role, they can't.
Alicia, what do you see?
Yeah, I mean, echoing we're really invested stakeholders, right? I would say the most invested stakeholders. I would say we're also really trusted and generous stakeholders. That what you said is when we have power, when we're given agency, or when we take our own agency, what you see is that we're unfolding that back into our own community. And what we've seen even across the survivor community across the U.S. with some of the recent administrative changes, we have the resources, because what we know about trafficking and what we know about people who've experienced this is that it's a highly intersectional issue. We've existed outside of the systems for a really long time because those opaque systems were created to exploit us, right? They were created opaque for a reason. And so we're really creative in that sense of, let's not let's not pretend to use the systems of the government and such that created this in the first place. And so we have some creative solutions, and to see our community development hats come back on and regain, we're going to take care of our own community.
So one thing, I'm going to say one thing to follow up and come back to you for your thing. This is actually why one of the first slides that we saw today is members of the U.S. colored troops standing on a Confederate train. That notion of chattel slavery in the United States ended because black folks who had been enslaved suddenly were able to march on their own and to go out and fight that war. And they were fighting with allies. They were fighting with white folks from Connecticut who went off and died, Yale students who went off and died, and specifically wrote letters that David Blight and others have uncovered that said they were doing that because slavery is horrible and has to be stamped out. But it didn't end until the actual people, the survivors, were able to get out there and be in the fight and be part of it. I think that's one of the reasons why, for me, that's such an important slide to have. When we're thinking about survivor leadership, I think we often think about the last 10 years or so, since there's a law that said you have to have a survivor advisory council, or the Survivor Alliance gets formed, or something like that. And what we really need to be thinking about is the survivors in the late 1700s in England who were part of the fight, and the survivors in the early 1800s in the United States who stepped up and led. And there has never been a fight against slavery that has not succeeded because of the people who were themselves in that situation. I think we have to check ourselves if we ever think that this was something done for them as opposed to by them.
So just real quick, that asymmetry between CSR and its goals and effectiveness, and WSR and its goals and effectiveness, is actually has a very practical consequence. So CSR doesn't work. That's been demonstrated over and over and over again. It doesn't. It may work temporarily to quell the public relations issue, right? But because it doesn't change the dynamics on the ground, the abuses that drove that first crisis, the public relations crisis, will continue, and they will eventually occur again, and the crisis will recur. So even at the top, it's only a temporary win, right? But when you actually put out the human rights crisis at the bottom of the whole supply chain, then it doesn't just serve the interests of the workers who no longer have to be beaten, raped, or robbed by their bosses. It helps the producers who no longer have to face potential legal risks created by those crimes. And then it helps the buyers who no longer have to face the reputational harm created by those crimes. So it's actually the only one. It's not just asymmetry in terms of effectiveness. It's asymmetry in terms of win-win-win versus nobody wins. But we're reaching the point where people are starting to understand that, though.
So one of the things that occurs to me is that if you had basically come to me in 1996 and said, we're going to have this fair food program thing, what is it that should be the standard? I, as the government, would have said, oh, we need to have a standard that is against violence in the fields, because I enforce the 13th Amendment. I'm the government. And what's interesting is that when the workers end up basically creating this, they start saying, we need to actually only have to fill our tomatoes to the top of the bin, as opposed to getting required to have a mound of tomatoes. So instead of a 30-pound bucket, it's a 40-pound bucket. That's called cupping. Can you tell us what cupping is? And why is it that the workers, the outside world, we're like, oh my God, they're being enslaved. Let's have that be the focus. Right. And they come in and they say, yes, that, and let's do something about cupping. Right. Why was cupping such a big deal to the workers?
So there are any number of reasons why worker-driven social responsibility is more effective. One of them is that when you are writing up the code of conduct that you're going to enforce in the program, right? Like you said, you could hire somebody from Columbia Law and have them experts, massive experts actually, in writing codes of conduct who were very tied to the anti-sweatshop movement in the 90s and onward. But they aren't experts in farm work. They aren't experts in tomato harvesting or watermelon harvesting. Only tomato workers or watermelon workers are experts in that. And it turns out that there are particular forms of exploitation in every single sector and subsector of agriculture that the workers know and no one else does. And so in this case, one of them is cupping, which is a requirement the old requirement in the fields, where you're paid by the bucket, and the bucket's a 32-pound bucket when it's full, flat, right? When it's not overcupped. But you could not hand that flat bucket up to the person called a dumper, the person on top of the truck. You saw in the video when they were throwing it up. If you threw it up like that, flat, you stood the chance of having it come right back down from 10 feet above you with all the tomatoes in it, hitting you in the face. I can't tell you how many times we've seen this, where people got broken noses, and then there were fights that broke out, and it just got uglier from there, because the dumper thought you hadn't filled it up enough. But when you fill it like that to the level that they want, you're actually, it's a built-in systemic 10% wage theft system, right? Because you get paid by the bucket, yet every time you do a bucket, you do 1/10 of a bucket more. So when you do 10 buckets, you've actually done 11. You've picked the weight of 11, but you're not getting paid for that weight. So one of the first things that we did when we sat down over a long period within the Coalition of Mock Workers, before we even could launch the program, we were building our code, was to identify what's the vision we have. And this is the envisioning that architects do, right? When how do we see, how do we want to use this house? Do we want to have an exercise room? Do we want to have a solarium? Do we, whatever the hell. But they think of the things that could be possible, and then they build them into the house. That's what workers did with the code. And one of the first things they said was, we've got to stop cupping. It has to end here. And lo and behold, we put that in. We said all workers must be paid for every pound of tomatoes that they pick. But beyond that, once we launched the program, we realized that was not, there's 1,000 ways you could try to do that, and they're all really incredibly difficult. So we had to, in the process, have to figure out operationally, how do you make that work? And then we worked actually with the growers to do that, to figure out how not to do the least violence to the production process, to be able to do that right. And we figured a very simple rule: no tomato can be fully above the rim. That defines the full bucket, right? And so for 15 years since, no more cupping, no more violence, no more disputes. And it works.
So, Alicia, one of the things that we've talked about is just between us is, that notion of lived experience knowledge on the part of a survivor, but also we are now in a plethora of riches with survivors that have a lot of experiences as well as lived experience. And I think that one of the things that we're seeing from Greg's recounting is that the lived experience of those farm workers made them experts in that type of farm work in a way that nobody else was. Yeah. But I think you've seen folks, whether it's your own work or in the other folks in the Survivor Network, who are then developing another set of experiences that are informed by their lives. Have you seen some interesting or kind of cool things that are happening out there as a result of that?
Yeah, I think what you're getting at is that
we didn't practice this question.
Yeah. So what we have found is, everyone has a why to why they're doing the work that they do. And as I say that, it's a very privileged statement because not everyone gets to have a why to execute their job or their career. But when you ask survivors of exploitation, either sexual or labor-based, over and over again, their why is so that others don't experience that, right? And embedded in this exploitation is, no matter what, an economic exploitation, right? And so there's this passion to have economic sustainability, to do this work so that others aren't exploited. And so that is far beyond what we consider our lived experience or just telling our story and retelling the story of exploitation over and over again, right? Like, I don't know about you guys, but for most people, it's not common that you walk into work and are asked about, hey, tell me about your trauma. What's your trauma narrative? What's the worst thing that ever happened to you, right? But we saw in our field that that's kind of where survivors were stuck, just giving their narrative of exploitation and trauma over and over again. And so what we did as our own community is say, like, no, we want to engage this work, but we don't want to just tell our sad story. What we want to do is we want to be leaders. We want to engage narrative change. We want to be doing research. We want to be lawyers. We want to be doctors in the Congo, helping women where rape is being used as a tactic of war, right? And so we're expanding our own identity, not to be attached to just like one story of our exploitation, but far beyond in this work. Was that what you were getting at?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, good.
So those are best practices. We've got 2 minutes and 1 second to talk about worst practices. What have you seen that either makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up thinking about it, or is going to make the hair on the back of their necks with things that have been, shall we say, clumsily done. By
Yeah,
people who
clumsily.
want to-
Yeah, I'll give you a clumsy one. I mean, since worker driven social responsibility has emerged in the last 15 years, and the idea of worker voice has become a big, new idea in the world of social responsibility, there have been any number of initiatives that are trying to take one piece or another piece, but you see the structure. The structure has several overlapping, interwoven pieces that without all of them and without the power driving it, which is in the agreements between workers and buyers at the top, that legally commit buyers, not voluntarily, legally commit buyers to only buying from growers who are certified in this program. Without those elements, it doesn't work, right? But early in our time of organizing for this, we'd gotten our first agreement with Taco Bell. We moved on to McDonald's, and McDonald's was determined to stop that whole thing right there, right? To kill it in the crib. And so they got together with their growers, and they got together with local, in Immokalee, local conservative, but community centers like daycare centers and that sort of thing. They aren't involved in trying to make workers' lives better in the fields at work. They take care of the kids, and so they get a lot of money from business. So they brought them into a process to develop what they called SAFE, which was socially accountable farm employers. Right? And it was designed exactly to be the counter narrative to the program that we were trying to build at the time, the Fair Food Program. And they had all the right people in it, all the good people of town and all the good people of the area and major companies, and it looked like a real serious thing. They had all the graphics they could put together to make it look as strong as it is. But here's the clumsy part. They come to Immokalee, the town where we are and where we organize and where we were fighting this fight. And in this case, after McDonald's had signed, because we still beat them because they screwed up in other ways, after McDonald's had signed, Burger King, SAFE was still alive. Burger King came to Immokalee, and in a very highly touted public relations event, had them tour the fields of their suppliers that day, and then have a public relations or a public press conference in Immokalee saying, I'm not going to name the auditing firm just out of unnecessary kindness, but the firm said, we have toured these fields and there is no slavery in these fields whatsoever, which makes no sense at all to say. You can't walk into a field and determine whether there's slavery in the field for a day. I mean, that's the stupidest thing in the world to say. Anybody who's ever done this work would know that's the stupidest thing in the world to say. A 2-year-old wouldn't say that if they knew what they were talking about. Anyway, but they did that, and that's sufficient for public consumption, right? Funny thing is, because fate is not without a sense of irony, as they said in The Matrix, that same day was the last major slavery case in Immokalee that broke the camel's back. Workers who had been locked inside with chains inside a U-Haul truck for months and forced to work in the fields, pounded their way through the plastic roof of the truck and escaped. And they came to the Coalition Immokalee Workers, and they came to the police, and they denounced the employer, and that employer was arrested and prosecuted, as you know. So that the same literally day that they had that very expensive and ridiculous press conference was when workers 2 blocks away from where they did it in the Immokalee escaped from a U-Haul truck where they were chained inside.
So we're out of time, but I will say that my soundtrack to all of that is the fake NGO/certifying body comes out with their fake certification, which is something that if one is new to this could easily fall into using a fake certifier, comes out and says there is no slavery in the fields of Immokalee, and then the narrator comes in and says there was slavery in the fields of Immokalee.
2 blocks away.
Exactly. Yes. So thank you guys for all of this, and we're, I think, to the next panel.
What is known as the home stretch. We're going to turn now to 2 methodological discussions. First, my buddies Ryan Welch, and my former student, I have to say with pride, and Kaylee Hoop from Kieran Timberlake and Bureau Happold are going to talk a little bit about technological strategies to approach this problem. And then we're going to close with a really interesting conversation about work that's going on in the State Department. It'll be a larger group of Lou's colleague Shavi Nana, who is from Michigan Law, Amy O'Neill Richards, and Anna Tomich from the State Department, and Sean McDonald from Verite. And we're going to do a kind of case study on embassy projects, and then we'll finish up with about 20 minutes of discussion.
Okay.
So,
and we've got 20 minutes between
you two guys have 20 minutes, and those guys have 20 minutes.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Phil, for the introduction, and to Phil and Lou for the invitation to join you today. So we're also speaking on behalf of Yale because Kaylee and I, through our practices, Burrow Happold and Karen Timberlake, actually worked with Yale, specifically led by Phil, in an exercise about 2 years ago to develop a sort of proof of concept methodology for putting labor exploitation risk calculation in the hands of designers. So Kaylee and I are here to speak today from the perspective of developers of design tools to reflect on how design tools shape our architectural practice, how they inform our design work, and how we may be able at some point in the future to use these types of tools to expose architects to considerations of labor exploitation risk. I'm just going to zoom ahead here. So leveraging digital tools that are fully integrated into our design process, we're able to answer a wide range of questions from various topics. Jacob actually earlier alluded to how architectural professional responsibility has expanded to consider various impacts or measures of building performance. And it's worth noting that now architects have at their fingertips tools to calculate things like daylight, energy use, and now, as Alan highlighted, embodied carbon calculations and life cycle assessment. And these tools are very accessible to us. They're very nimble, but rarely are we in a position as practitioners to really interrogate the tools that we use and the data and methodologies that underlie them. We sort of trust that the people that make tools and procure data sets for us have done their homework, and we're rarely do we have the opportunity to really interrogate them. So that really places a substantial curatorial burden on the makers of data sets and tools to assure both the quality of underlying data sets, as well as to ensure that designers are equipped with the knowledge and background to really qualify their results and understand the limitations of inferences that they can make. And this is especially true in cases of dynamic, elusive, we've heard deep data, such as that which underlies the global supply chain of construction and building materials. And we're fortunate, Kaylee and I, to be able to reflect upon our experience in environmental life cycle assessment, or LCA, as another emerging practice, perhaps a bit more mature, that draws upon detailed knowledge of construction supply chains, though not from the human dimension of exploitative labor practices, but rather from the dimension of chemical emissions associated with each step in design. And as Alan mentioned earlier, we've sort of come to this familiarity with this notion of embodied environmental impact, that when products come to our project site, they have essentially captured within their data the whole history of their formation, from raw material extraction, processing, transportation, installation, and perhaps even their future life beyond. So provided that someone has done the hard work of systematically collecting this data, not just for the aluminum mullion extrusion that you see represented here, but for every building product that we might consider, then we, as architects, are left with the really relatively simple task of quantity surveying. That is, that there's a clear disciplinary boundary here between expert practices that are modeling this data and providing hopefully harmonized data sets that we can rely on, and provided we know the sort of performance attributes that we're after and how much is going into our building, we at least can make that connection. And it's worth noting, I think, another way that we can learn from LCA in that there's been incredible development in the past 15 years here. You heard that, I think a couple other folks in the previous session mentioned that if you were to ask architects about 15 years ago whether you could use environmental LCA as an iterative design tool, it would have seemed absurd. But we've seen a tremendous growth in the ecosystem of tools, methodologies, data sets, and indeed policy that work very much hand in hand to sort of bring this to the foreground. And I think perhaps one of the most interesting developments here is the really groundswell of environmental product declarations, where manufacturers are seeing the value argument in laying bare the environmental footprints of their products in the form of EPDs. And we would hope that at some point in the future, there's a similar groundswell of social product declarations. So with that background in mind, I'd like to just briefly talk about this project that we worked on with Borough Happold and Yale. This essentially takes what's effectively a translation of an ELCA, or environmental LCA methodology, which essentially boils down to what do you have in your building and what are the impacts associated with those materials. And if we translate that into a risk calculation and extend it to consider where are materials coming from and how do we come up with geographic or some indicators of risk intensity embedded in those building materials, can we put that sort of calculation methodology in the hands of designers to make decisions? So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Kaylee, who's going to talk further about the methodology.
Thanks, Ryan. So in March of 2020, and I will not forget that date because it was right before we shut down, I was giving a presentation about environmental life cycle assessment to a client, and I was approached by one of the partners at Borough Happold, Gabe Williams, who's involved with Design for Freedom. He said, "What do you think about the idea of being able to measure the number of hands that have been exploited through the creation of those materials?" And I said, eyes bulging, with what data? What data is out there that would help to describe the gravity of this problem? So upon doing a bit of research in this space and trying to find relevant data sets, we landed on two particular data sets, and Karen Timberlake had the exact same idea of what pieces of data we would use as part of this proof of concept. One being the ITUC's Global Rights Index that measures the likelihood of slavery on a scale of 1 to 6. It's also country level data, but they focus a lot on worker voice. There also was the Global Slavery Index on a scale of 0 to 1,000 in terms of the likelihood that you would be an enslaved person as part of a country. However, that definition also included things like forced marriage. And then we also had the US Census data, which everyone I'm sure is familiar with, but in terms of determining imports and exports of particular raw materials to and from this country. So those are our primary sources of data. So what would this POC look like for us? So what is a methodology for calculating labor exploitation risk in the built environment? And our goal here was that if we developed a methodology using the available data, that we could essentially empower designers in the AEC environment to prioritize those socially sustainable materials and getting some kind of hotspot analysis. So that left us with three primary sources of material, one being what are our buildings made of at a raw material level? Ryan presented a very nice diagram of what that might look like for a piece of glazing. However, do we know that for all of the pieces of a building? Skill we should probably build. The second being, where do those materials come from? Are we aware of the provenance of all of those raw materials that are a part of the built environment supply chain? And then also, what is the labor exploitation risk associated with those materials? And at the time, we had no idea our profound lack of understanding of this space. So first, thinking about the raw material breakdown and doing that in a systematic way. I think we perhaps had this understanding from the ELCA world that starting with a structural system is perhaps the easiest because they rely on three primary materials being timber, concrete, and steel. And being able to break those down to their raw material components is relatively easy, right? You look at something like glulam, it's timber and some glues. You look at concrete, it's cement, aggregate, sand, water, plasticizers. And then looking at steel, you're looking at iron, you're looking at limestone or coke, as well as zinc coating. So looking at those primary raw materials, we came to the conclusion that there were about 20 materials we could start with in the structural space. Now, I do want to liken this to the environmental LCA space, where we have largely excluded a lot of the built environment in terms of MEP systems. I would be amiss in not saying that. I'm an MEP engineer. There are a lot of metallic components in MEP systems. We're not very good at breaking them down. The same thing for facade systems. Increasingly complex when you move on from structural systems, let alone interior assemblies. Now, thinking about those data sets that we would also be able to apply in terms of the where did they come from question, that's not something we know a lot about. It's easier when you think about something like timber in terms of trying to find the forest that it's associated with, but when you get to that grand scale of very small quantities of things that may come from lots of different places, it's quite difficult. And then also thinking about the breadth of social impact topics that could be included in this conversation, again, using the two data sets that we did have available. So that left us with a few calculation scenarios. One being, first, assuming what you know is in your building. We start with that question. So saying we've got 100 kilograms of cement in our buildings. Now, we know that this is typically to the tune of millions of kilograms if you're looking at a 100,000 square foot building. But thinking about what components would we have, how much of them do we have, and then asking, where did they come from? The default assumption is, I have no idea where they came from because the environmental product declarations don't disclose where things come from. And then also saying, by those kind of default countries based on the US Census data, where did those imports likely come from and by what percentage, so that we could then assess the likelihood of risk associated with those items with the Global Slavery Index and the ITUC. Calculation scenario number 2 is that I have figured out where those materials come from. That was the case in the building we studied, UPenn's Amy Gutman Hall, and there was a lot of timber on the building, and that was sourced by Nordique Structures in Canada, and they knew the forests that it came from. We were able to get to that depth of information. And also, in the third calculation scenario, you would not only know the provenance of those materials, but the working conditions associated with the materials in terms of being able to have those very meaningful conversations either with the manufacturer directly or with the workers themselves. Now, our response in this theoretical scenario would be that you would then reduce the risk associated with all of those materials that you had procured during this process of designing the building. We created a user interface for this because Ryan and I are tool designers, so naturally that was the logical step in terms of being able to present this proof of concept to peer reviewers. And this is what it looked like. And on the right side, you can see the breakdown of raw materials. That's Amy Gutman Hall's structural bill of materials. And then looking at the likely provenance of each of those materials by mass. In meeting with many of you in this room to actually peer review this, we realized that this was not sufficient in terms of being able to take a pass at what this would look like for the built environment in a meaningful way and actually being able to impact workers in a meaningful way, which should be our goal. So we have a few data limitations listed up here, but I would like to just point out that this did not limit the cognitive burden on designers, right? You're having to build new skills in many ways. Also, the raw material skill that we have is not there, and it doesn't actually help. We need to have that skill built in first as an industry. The fidelity of the provenance of those materials. When we looked at the census data, Nora earlier presented the provenance of cobalt globally. The US Census data would tell you that all the cobalt comes from Norway, or I think it was 60% of it. None comes from the DRC. Norway was actually not on the producers list presented earlier. Pass-through countries are a big problem that we face. So I think that fidelity question around the provenance was not answered as well. And then we also failed greatly in describing or quantifying the human experience associated with working in these industries, let alone the timeliness of the data sets, representation. A lot of this data was, again, aggregated up to country level. However, we know that they were able to have conversations at the individual level within particular industries, and that's data we would love to see in this space. Also, the incompleteness of social impact considerations in the data sets, and then the incomplete supply chain network. LCA provides a great framework for us in terms of the timescale of a building, going from raw material, moving those materials to the finished product, moving them to site, constructing them on site. Many of those are not considered as part of our methodology at all. And we would love to see a more robust environment around all of those topics. Pass it back to Ryan.
So I'd like to just reflect on a couple of thoughts about environmental LCA and its sort of neighbor social LCA. And Billy Faircloth in her keynote tonight, I think we'll expand on this even further. But just to reflect that even if we had a really rich traceable data set that's timely, representative, and really disaggregated in the way that Kaylee was referring to, I think there's still some challenges and opportunities in how we make that data available to the ultimate consumers, in our case, design professionals. And in environmental LCA, we tend to reduce things to chemicals of concern. These are good indicators of various environmental impacts, be it global warming potential, acidification, eutrophication. And fundamentally, chemicals lend themselves really well to quantification. And in certain cases, like global warming potential, they are truly fungible. A kilogram of CO2 emissions in Connecticut is the same as a kilogram of CO2 emissions anywhere on the planet. But as you heard even as recently from Greg, the effects of certain labor practices on individuals is highly contingent on local conditions and the social infrastructure in which they occur. So there's a hello. So I think that there may be some challenges with trying to come up with really appropriate indicators to communicate various types of impacts. But furthermore, as we heard from Sheila this morning, these are really visceral problems, and there's a real human dimension to these that we need to capture and not lose sight of that in trying to reduce everything to numbers. So I think these are just some considerations that I'd like to offer, maybe ones that we can pick up on in tomorrow's discussion, in tomorrow's working sessions around how to communicate this information to designers that are ultimately making these types of decisions. We showed earlier the sort of groundswell of EPDs. I think there's some doubt around what social product declarations would yield, or maybe just some concerns given that unlike environmental declarations, which are sort of safely behind the abstraction of numbers, here we're dealing with issues that have very serious public relation risks for companies involved. So in the meantime, I think we need to look to this entire network, this very deep network of the global construction supply chain, and consider other sources for data and insights that might help influence how designers engage with this. Kayla, you want to close here?
We didn't want to leave you in the pit of despair, so we're going to lean on a couple of things that are happening in this space. We've actually seen slides like this over and over again in terms of describing what is available to us as an industry, what tools can we lean on, and we do have some faith in certifications being a source of information to us, wanting to be critical actually of those certifications and making sure that they're third-party verified and following the International Guide to Fair Trade labels, all of the criteria there. We do also have frameworks and tools, things like the Common Materials Framework, which is born out of mindful materials, and also the AIA in terms of not only assessing the environmental effects of a material, but its health impacts, and then essentially the human impacts that we are discussing here, as well as things like the responsible sourcing tool, which are available to us, and then also the Design for Freedom International Guidance and Toolkit, and the many communities that have formed around this space. I would say as part of an ADCAR approach, we are in the awareness stage as an industry, and maybe approaching desire to actually make a change. I'd also like to thank the team that worked on this between Yale, Karen Timberlake, and Bureau Happold. But as Billy famously always says, there is a risk to measuring risk, and we should not sleepwalk into sleeping better at night. So that's a large lesson that we learned as part of this project. Thank you all.
So I want to say, as a member of that team, I've been in this room for many years. No one ever presents a failed project. That was one of the first ones. But as my colleagues in the management school say, we learned a lot from our failure. So we're going to finish up with this case study from the State Department, which should be a super interesting way to close things out. And I guess, Chavi, you're going to go first, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, let me see this scary clicker.
Well,
All right.
why you scared the clicker?
Now, what am I? Okay, what am I doing now? This? Yes, good. Okay. Okay. Hi, everybody. So I was going to give a different speech this morning, but then you all stole my talking points, and also you've been sitting here for a very long time today. So I'm going to make just a couple of points about policy and law, and then look briefly at sort of three tools that I think have not, well, one's already been discussed, I'll make 1 point on it, but two that I think have not really been discussed. So I think the main thing that I want to say is I was kind of asked to table set, but that's hard to do in a time of great uncertainty. And then I was also getting a bit of a vibe this morning that things feel like they are so uncertain and a little bit lost. And I guess what I want to remind us of is that we have actually made some progress. We've made progress in the law, and there are ways to use this as an opportunity to fight further. So, as we know, supply chains are still global, even if the current tariff regime is trying to disregard that or wreck it. CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, still translates soft law into hard law and creates opportunities to move forward. U.S. laws are still on the books and have statute of limitations, SOLs that are longer than the 4 years we're hopefully going to be dealing with the current administration or its successors. Oh, thanks. Sorry, I'm talking into the clicker. And there are tools. There are tools to develop responsibly. This is sort of the bad old days. I was thinking kind of Great Gatsby. It might feel like we're still there, like we're back there, but I think that there are ways that we can move it forward. So to track, we've moved from a set of sort of disclosure laws, and still have them on the books in UK and Australia, that sort of recommend that companies report out on things, but don't actually require that they do anything to change the issues that they might identify in their policies. It was a start. It was a first generation. The UK Transparency Act has just had its 10th anniversary, and there's been a whole set of discussions in the UK about how to make that stronger, and they've just come out with a much more detailed guidance to help companies comply with the law. Students in the U of M trafficking immigration lab have been doing some work looking at the UK Modern Slavery Act statements and offering recommendations about best practices, essentially. So we've made progress. We now have a set of laws in a number of European countries and the European Union that look at human rights and environmental due diligence and are asking companies to go through this entire process. This is a much different set of expectations than the basic disclosure that says, oh, tell us what you're doing. Give us no real way to verify that, and ask you no questions about how you're actually solving the problems that you are identifying. Now, the German supply chain due diligence act did seem like it was one of the strongest levers that we had out there. 2 days ago, as Sheila said, it has been rescinded, ostensibly to merge into the CSDDD, whatever that ends up looking like. Now, if implemented, and we all have a role in making sure that this is not just a tick box exercise and that it's not performative, this would be a step forward. This is actually asking companies to implement policies, to have policies, implement them, identify risks, mitigate them, and then remediate. And so does have a role in sort of advancing the game. On the trade law piece, you've already heard about the the 1930 Tariff Act, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. The EU forced labor regulation is a slightly different beast and actually offers a little bit more scope for prevention. What I want to say about the two U.S. trade-related legislation, they don't really get a whole lot into prevention and only minimally really into remediation, although there are ways that we can push on both of those issues. The EU forced labor regulation does actually offer more incentive for companies to actually do prevention on the front end because there is a potential to avoid an investigation if you can show that you have performed human rights and environmental due diligence and done some remediation. Again, this is not yet enforced, and enforcement on both the CSDDD and the forced labor regulation really remain to be seen. I'm going to come back to government contracting in a minute because it loops into discussions on responsible contracting principles. Finally, corruption laws. One of my big bones to pick generally and historically, and I say this all the time, my students are tired of it, is that we should be talking about corruption a whole lot more when we're talking about forced labor. I've been saying it for a long time, so I'm going to keep saying it. It's not the best moment to say that, given that the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is no longer being enforced, or at least there's a pause. But I have faith that it will be in the future, and we also still have the UK Bribery Act. So I think that those are conversations that we need to keep having and keep bringing in corruption, because the same corrupt deal-making that happens with government officials that can be subject to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or the UK Bribery Act is also reinforcing structures of forced labor in many of these projects. Okay, so looking at then a couple of solutions. So Greg obviously has already talked about worker-driven social responsibility models that are the backbone of many binding agreements. This is really about asking yourself where you are sourcing from. Where are you putting your money? And what is that money doing? What is it supporting? Is it supporting programs like the Fair Food Program, Milk with Dignity, the International and Pakistan Accords, the Dindigul, Lesotho, and Central Java agreements that have workers involved in the formation of the project and also have different opportunities for working in environments to support freedom of association and collective bargaining in both high union density and low union density environments. And so you need to be asking questions about what programs are available, where you can support them in the choices that you're making about sourcing. Contracting relationships. We've seen a lot of different slides about the different relationships across a construction supply chain. And so I think that this is where models of responsible contracting can actually be really valuable in thinking about some of those conversations. So in traditional contracts, the relationship between the buyer and supplier is generally one of it's pretty static, and it deals with reps and warranties. So in the supply chain, let's say a garment supply chain, for example, the buyer is going to say to the supplier, in order to get this contract, you have to sign something that says you have no forced labor in your supply chain, ever, and we'll never have it. That's almost certainly incorrect. And what it does is it incentivizes the supplier to lie about issues that they find because they're afraid that the buyer is going to cut and run when they find them. And if the buyer cuts and runs, it may be a PR win for them because no one wants forced labor in the supply chain, but it changes absolutely nothing for the worker on the ground. Traditional contracts also do not recognize the role that the buyer often plays in creating supply chain instability, and it also doesn't focus on remedy. And so if you're looking at responsible contracting, it has three principles. It says that buyer and supplier need to have a shared commitment to cooperating on human rights and environmental due diligence. So you communicate, you build a relationship of trust. the buyer needs to also make sure that the supplier understands that they're not going to cut and run at the first instance of trouble, and they're going to actually support the supplier in remedying. Second principle is that the buyer commits to responsible purchasing practices, to not changing up lead times, to not changing up orders without figuring out how it's going to impact the ability of the supplier to actually make those changes. And then finally, it prioritizes human rights remediation. So buyer and supplier work in it together to work on remediation unless that is not possible, and then focusing on responsible exit. I think, sorry, just to come back to contracting for one sec, one of, I think, the weaknesses in the way that we think about government contracting is it is a responsibility. There is a prohibition in the FAR for selling goods made with forced labor to the US government. But from experience working with companies who've had to do this, the way in which that is safeguarded is generally in a pass down from the government to the general contractor and to subcontractors. And there's not a lot of checks on whether what the subcontractor says further down the supply chain is actually true. And so this is a way where responsible contracting, I think, in public procurement could also play a really valuable role. And then finally, this is not so much something that those of us who are buying or parts of companies and supply chains can do, but it's another outside source of pressure that can be brought to bear on some of these supply chain discussions. Investors. So I work with investors at the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. They care about corporate risk and do not only define that corporate risk as financial. They also care that the corporations in which they are investing have good reputations and engage with the companies on a regular basis about issues that they see in their supply chains. They can bring the pressure to bear in a shareholder resolution process, although that has been limited under the current administration, as well as with ongoing corporate dialogues. And I'll just leave you with one example of that. So after all the reporting in the New York Times about a disproportionately high rate of hysterectomies in the India sugarcane industry, a number of investors started engaging with, I think we have 7 or 8 companies that we're engaging, with which we're engaging on a regular basis, and have been working with the local Indian union organizer, independent union organizer, Chandan Kumar, to inform those corporate dialogues and to think about what is going on the ground. He is now working with Greg and the Coalition of Immokalee Workers team and has established a Fair Food Program India program to involve workers in coming up with a fair food program to deal with these issues in the sugarcane industry. And we continue, the investors, to have conversations with companies to get them brands to join in that program. So I will leave you with that and turn it over to my co-panelists.
I need that. Okay, so this is it?
You got it.
Okay. So, good afternoon. With my 5 minutes, I'm going to cover the signature law that created our office in the U.S. Department of State, our primary reporting tool, and a key federal acquisition regulation. So the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 is the law that created the Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons, or TIP office. Luckily for us, it's a bipartisan law. It's been reauthorized at least 5 times. And the law really sets forward a whole of government approach to fighting human trafficking, both domestically and internationally. It also established a cabinet-level task force, the President's Interagency Task Force, to monitor and combat trafficking in persons, and it mandated the annual Trafficking in Persons report. So the TIP report is the State Department's primary diplomatic and diagnostic tool used to engage foreign governments around the world on the issue of human trafficking. Okay, I'm not sure which one. Oh, yay, okay. So the TIP report covers 188 different countries, including the United States, and it includes prioritized recommendations for anti-trafficking actions in the areas of prevention, protection, and prosecution. The report is really useful for stakeholders to learn more about the different forms of human trafficking occurring in each country and the tailored areas for foreign governments to address. So, for example, I'll give you some recommendations straight out of the report directed to a few different governments. Conduct proactive inspections of labor-intensive industries for labor violations and forced labor. Refer violations to appropriate authorities, including criminal investigations in cases of potential labor trafficking, and refer potential victims to services. We also would have another set of recommendations would be consistently enforce strong regulations and oversight of labor recruitment companies, including by eliminating recruitment fees charged to migrant workers and holding fraudulent labor recruiters criminally responsible. So data analytics from our 2024 TIP report show the prevalence of forced labor is in industries throughout the world. We found, for example, that in 40 out of 188 country narratives, so 21%, describe concerns about forced labor in manufacturing. 63 narratives, 34%, mention concerns in mining. A whopping 142, or 76%, flagged concerns about the construction sector. Earlier analysis of TIP reports for the construction sector showed similar numbers. So it's clear that these risks play out all over the world, and concerns in the construction sector are not an anomaly, but rather a serious area to address. Sorry, it's hard to see. But the U.S. government is also working to prevent human trafficking in its own procurement of goods and services. So the U.S. government last year spent roughly $750 billion through contacts, which gives us tremendous influence and leverage. Don't worry, I'm not going through each one of these. But as you can see from the slide, there's been decades of legislative action focused on human trafficking protections in federal contracts. Over time, these moves led to a significant regulation entitled, was mentioned earlier, the Federal Acquisition Regulation on Combating Trafficking in Persons. The policy and contract clause was strengthened in 2015, prohibiting federal contractors, contractor employees, subcontractor employees, and their agents from engaging in a wide range of human trafficking and trafficking-related activities, such as using forced labor, destroying, concealing, confiscating, or otherwise denying access by an employee to his or her identity or immigration documents. Anna, we're going to hear from her next, or after Sean, I think, will share more during her remarks about how the State Department's Bureau of Overseas Building Operations works with contractors to implement this important regulation, and a bit about an exciting pilot project that we're partnering on together with Verite and OBO. Finally, and this will tee it up for Sean, in terms of supply chain work, the TIP office provides federal contractors, companies, and other stakeholders with a set of due diligence, resources, and tools to better prevent and address forced labor in their global supply chains. So we've long engaged with Verite on the responsible sourcing tool. We think it's an incredible, comprehensive online resource with 6 sets now at this point of downloadable risk management tools and resources on 11 key sectors and 43 commodities, most at risk for human trafficking. I'm going to let Sean share more about RST, and I think RST was probably developed under Ambassador Luis C. DeBaca, probably as we look back, or the genesis and the idea for it. So anyway, Sean is going to share more, and I'll turn it over to him.
Thanks, Amy. And it has been a big privilege for us at Verite to have worked with you for so many years. And as you say, the genesis of this program, this seems like a different clicker than the others. There we go. Was back when Lou was ambassador. And it's also been a real pleasure with Lou and Phil over the years as they've developed their course to interact with them and then to be part of the Design for Freedom process at Grace Farms. In particular because, as many people have noted, this sector seems to be on the cusp of trying to address this issue. It seems like a big, complex issue, but is doing it in a way that can build on some of the successes and failures of the past. So that's why it's great that you're bringing together groups that have had really concrete successes like the CIW Fair Food Program that Greg was mentioning. I wanted to just quickly highlight some of the things that we've been doing over the past couple of decades that enable us to put together this responsible sourcing tool that will enable all of you in this sector, but then also so many other sectors, to not only understand the risk, the data around risk, but more importantly, to move beyond just being paralyzed and overwhelmed by data to really focus on what works, what are some concrete business practices that can be changed, because it's really easy to think about modern day slavery as something so intimidating and big and scary and depressing, when it really in some ways is a series of business decisions that can be changed. We have found ways to change them. And also when people talk about trying to change capitalism, so to speak, you can see from Greg's slide when he talked about some of the most important companies in the world, they haven't gone out of business because Greg and his colleagues have held them accountable, have they? Capitalism is incredibly innovative and adaptive. Even though it's based on a lot of exploitation, there are ways to make companies change and still stay in business. And so some of these tools that we've developed are based on a lot of work with different brands across all labor rights, not just forced labor. A lot of it is focused on responsible recruitment, because that's so much the heart of where forced labor exists around the world. But we also do this in a way that incorporates a lot of input from a wide variety of stakeholders. What I really want to help you understand about this tool is it's really accessible for a lot of people from a lot of different sectors. So think about, as you're talking to your colleagues in design firms or in academia or wherever, all of us kind of face this world. We're sitting at a desk trying to understand it. And I really want to encourage you not to reinvent the wheel and think about how to develop new data sets or new tools and so on, but really to adapt things that have been done already. As Chavi said, there's an evolving approach to due diligence that's now being codified from soft law into hard law around what are the good processes, or not necessarily the good, but the requisite processes of due diligence, so you end up with something actually impactful. That's the heart of what we're trying to do. So in the responsible sourcing tool, we help you understand the problem. We help you identify the particular risks in your supply chain, but then come up with a variety of really practical tools for how to address it. What you're able to find on this tool is an understanding of where forced labor risk is by sector, by geography, by the type of labor that's involved, as well as the type of operations that are engaged at different parts of the supply chain, as well as various types of workforce characteristics. We have a really interactive, hopefully user-friendly way that you can have pull-down menus for the type of industry, for example, construction. Then it tees up all the different commodities that are associated with that sector, for example, like bricks. And then you can look at country. And then at the bottom, you can see links for how you can get in-depth information about the nature of forced labor risk by industry and by commodity. These are things that are always constantly updated. And then with the toolkit, as Amy mentioned, we have now 6 different kind of toolkits. Every year or two, we add a different one that really focuses on the particular characteristics of forced labor and different approaches that have been tested to deal with forced labor in those sectors. We do that with lots of input from civil society, unions, businesses themselves, as well as the survivor community, so that we're really bringing a lot of perspectives to bear. And we've just recently come out with one in the construction sector. And here you can see a wide variety of tools. Obviously, I don't have time to go into all of them, but it follows that mandatory due diligence framework that includes things like developing benchmarks of good practice and monitoring. I really want to emphasize, we put a lot of emphasis here in having a comprehensive approach without assuming that every company is going to be able to do this right away, right? Because people do have to kind of take some baby steps first, but it gives them a viewpoint of all the things that are necessary so that people don't think they can pick and choose. Even if they develop things perhaps on an incremental basis, we're trying to really show how you need to have a really comprehensive system if you're really going to eventually be as effective as you need to be. We, just for example, have a lot of information within our tool set, particularly on recruitment, because this is where you get a lot of the abuse that several people throughout the day have highlighted. And we also give information about the proper kind of worker communication and grievance mechanisms, including links to information about some of the more effective ones, like the worker-driven social responsibility model. And then a lot of information about how you can screen labor recruitment agents, because that's a key factor where there's a lot of risk. And then for those companies that have to present templates and figure out how to present all this information to buyers or to those that are contracting them, we present information about what are some kind of standard templates that can be tailored. So the basic idea I want to show here is not so much that there is a perfect way or one way to do it, but to note that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's been a lot of activity on this. It's still an evolving area, so we're always looking at updating it. That it's really important to not be overwhelmed by this, that you can take some of these steps. And also, I really want to mention that people talk a lot about data. Yes, we try to provide ways to show the data that exists about forced labor. I think people often feel, particularly in comparison to the environmental sector, that I think people in this world are much more familiar with the life cycle assessments and so on, that world is very quantifiable, and that somehow the labor world, let alone the forced labor world that's supposedly so deep and mysterious and hidden, is not quantifiable. In many ways it really is. Right? You can really determine how much people pay for jobs. You can determine how much employers are or are not paying for those costs. You can ask workers about how much they're getting paid, how much they need to get paid. You can ask about hours. You can ask about specific things like Greg mentioned about is there cupping or not. There are a lot of ways that these things can be quantified if you just know what to ask for. And then that's the kind of data that we should focus on, and not just data about risk where we already know where this problem is, but really data about who's changing, which companies are changing, how they're being accountable for that, and how those changes link to what changes the workers really want to see in their lives. But I really encourage you to push back about this notion that, oh, it's too hard, it's too complex. Yes, there are all sorts of historical and sociological and cultural factors at play, but there are also ways that you can really quantify what changes workers want to see in their lives and hold companies accountable for producing that data and then evaluating them and holding them accountable for it. Thank you.
Okay, no pressure.
There we go. Here I am, ready to bring it all back home. You guys can hear me okay? And I just want to make sure. Yes. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anna Tomic, and I work for Bureau of Overseas Buildings Operations, which is part of State Department, is a bureau within the State Department. Our main job really is to design, construct, and maintain over 25,000 units of buildings all over the globe that spread over 290 locations within all over the world. I'm sorry. Yes, so this current map here just shows the current construction projects that OBO has in place, and these projects range in size anywhere from the new embassy or consulate compound to some rehab project to a lease fit-out project, so just a very large scale of smaller to bigger projects. But it's really also meant to highlight the amount of impact that overseas buildings operations have on the construction sector within the world. And as such, sort of tying in with the conversation that Amy was mentioning, some of the rules of federal acquisition regulations and how we're applying those to our contracts, I would say that over the past about 10 years, OBO has been really working on upgrading our contracts to embed the FAR language into our contracts to ensure that these contractors cannot participate in any unfair labor practices. In addition to that, our construction management staff is also trained to spot any sort of unfair labor practices and are regularly checking all of the places where the workers work and live and making sure that there are proper health and safety measures applied there. So I think in kind of linking the conversation we received from our colleagues from Verite as well as with Amy's conversation, you can see that there is a really strong incentive for collaboration with these two teams. And for us at OBO, we're not a policy makers, we're a policy appliers. And so as new policies sort of come up, we are always working together with our teams to implement any of these new policies in our new projects. And this is where our project in Kampala, Uganda comes into place. This is a new office building annex on an existing US compound in Kampala, Uganda. Apologize. This is a 4-story building that will be a new home to our ambassador's office and several other agencies. In the very early concept design on this project, we started discussing the use of local materials. And we thought that since the new ambassador's office is going to be placed in this area, we wanted to draw something that is coming from the local spaces. And so using some type of local cladding, whether it's stone or whether it's brick, was something that was really important to us, and we wanted to use it as a symbol to express the US and the Uganda government relationship. It is also important to note that at this US mission, we are hosting International Labor Affairs, which is a subset of US Department of Labor, who are actively advocating for visibility on forced labor, improvement of workers' conditions, and raising living standards. So as such, I do believe that our project has this incredible opportunity to further the mission of the U.S. Embassy in Kampala and to promote ethical labor practices within the construction industry in Kampala. This project is designed by Crook & Sexton Partners, and I'm happy to say that Sarah Lundgren of Crook & Sexton Partners is here with us as well. The facade is composed of self-shading masonry panels and punched windows, and this shape of these panels and the shape of the building is very directly responding to the equatorial climate of Uganda. The choice of the locally sourced masonry is very deliberate and is meant to connect the building to its soil and to its heritage, which I think is really beautiful. This choice of a material offers significant opportunities. It is a very easily maintained material. It is going to perform very well in the climate of Kampala. It's going to be easily replaced. So in terms of maintenance, it's a great material to use. However, this product also faces a lot of challenges, as most of the speakers noted. Having brick being one of the challenging materials identified through most of the world. So with that, we believe that using this material was one of the great examples to implement Tool 1 of the Responsible Sourcing Toolkit and develop a list of 10 materials that we are including in the contract, which will be going out to solicitation to potential design builders.
who will be bidding on this project in May. And what we are asking of them with the hard work that our team from Crook and Sexton put together is to essentially learn about this list, use the tool one that's provided to us by Verite, and also maintain it as a contractual obligation through each deliverable to see how and if some of these risks are changing for the materials that are selected here. With this, we realized that we're making just very small steps, but we figured we'd start from somewhere. We're really hoping to get contractors to be willing to participants in gathering this information for us. There have been some other projects we were trying to pilot this tool one kit on who did not feel comfortable proceeding with that, and so I think this is a great step forward to getting them to be on board. But we're also hoping in terms of just OBO and learning a little bit more information about what's available and what challenges we have with materials that we're using on our buildings, to use this information to inform our future projects. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll take maybe 10 more minutes and chat if the speakers want to come up. Then we'll wrap it up. All right, so I guess the first question that occurs to me for our State Department colleagues is, we've been orbiting around this question of an integrated delivery model. And you guys have an integrated delivery model that starts with government policy and goes all the way to the construction site. How's it going? Let's slide the mic over so people know.
So I think I touched on it a little bit in our presentation. I think we are still trying to get contractors to be the willing participant in this. I believe that we are all very aware of the issues that are happening throughout the world and the impacts of these changes and maybe these transparencies are likely going to affect us in the ways we sort of discussed throughout the presentation in terms of schedule and probably cost. So for us right now, the goal is to start collecting information so that we can start to understand what this impact might be before we start applying this any further. Kampala being one of the examples. As we are collecting more of this information, our architecture office director is planning on briefing the front office. And while we had a buy-in from the previous director of OBO on this initiative, and we teamed up with our TIP office and Verite to implement some of these programs, we now do have a new director, we have new administration. So with every one of these steps, we sort of have to start from the beginning. So that's sort of how it's going. It's baby steps. It's recognizing there's an issue and trying to do everything from our perspective we can to try and implement some of these new policies.
Amy?
I would just add, so in addition to, I think, funding and supporting Verite and working with our Global Acquisitions Office and OBO, the very notion that we conceived of this risk mapping pilot that we are now applying, I think is a wonderful first step. And I also want to mention training. So in fiscal year 2024, over 82,000 U.S. federal acquisition employees in the U.S. government were trained on human trafficking, and my colleague Suzanne Balson, I think, trained about, Suzanne, what is it, like 24,000 in the State Department as well. So I think in terms of the risk mapping pilot, in terms of the provision of tools and resources, in terms of the collaboration and this unique pilot and this training, I think we are making incremental steps.
Okay, so let's put forward a little hypothetical here, because I think we've got all the players at the table. So, Ryan, your firm did the London Embassy, right? Randy, you guys have tools. Amy, you're setting policy. Chavi, you're going to be the lawyer for the design team. Okay. Anna, you're the client. Kaylee, you're the mechanical engineer. We're going to do the London Embassy, but we're going to start now instead of When did you guys do that job? Like 8 years ago? 10 years ago?
Well, it's spanned a number of years.
Okay.
Just design and finished probably in 2014 or 2020.
Okay, so we're negotiating the owner-architect agreement. Javi's your lawyer, because she's the expert on this. Okay? Kayla's going to be your sub-consultant, because she's your lead mechanical engineer. And as your client, you get to use his tools. Okay? How do we proceed here? What demands as the client are you going to make, Amy? And then tell Anna that she needs to get that stuff into the contract. We're doing a simulation here.
Okay, I am in the policy office, but I'm not the core. But I mean, I think it starts at the root of ensuring that the federal acquisition regulation is in all of the contracts and is being implemented.
Okay, so does that mean the contract says no forced labor materials in the building? And it's going, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, Javi, can you get that in the contract?
I will say though that over time we have shifted a little bit to be a little bit careful with. We cannot guarantee that there's zero tolerance for human trafficking in government procurement, but we can say that we are doing all that we can to work with the contractors, federal contractors, to implement a set of the FAR and a set of promising practices.
Okay, counselor?
Yeah. I'm not sure a lawyer today would say this, but I'm going to be a future lawyer.
Okay.
And say, I think that obviously I want zero tolerance.
Right.
We all do, right? But it's not realistic. And it creates, I would like it to be realistic, but the facts on the ground is that it often is not the case. And so saying zero tolerance, I think that the approach to trying to get FAR and tools in all the contracts is a much more reasonable reflection of the fact that we know that there will be forced labor on the ground. But that's where I would say, as your lawyer, if I need to have the FAR in my contract, then I also need to have some provision by which to ask suppliers further down the supply chain to be doing human rights and environmental due diligence, to actually be reporting up, so that I have access to the information that I need to be able to say, I've implemented it.
Okay, so we're going to, because I'm inventing this scenario on the fly. And we have a sort of pseudo-integrated delivery model here. Which means the client has more control over the relationship between the designers and the builders. Ryan, are you going to sign a contract that says there's no embodied forced labor in the building? And Kayla, you can answer second.
I'm not sure our lawyers would.
You got your lawyers right there.
Your lawyer is not allowing you to sign that contract.
Yeah.
Why?
We're assuming liability for a lot of things that are beyond our control.
Oh, here we go. Now we're right into it. Kayla, you agree?
As a data procurer, data scientist, I would have to look back at all of the projects that we had previously done with the embassies, which are Tegucigalpa and GUI, Nepal, and Nicaragua. I'd look back at that bill of materials very closely from a raw material perspective, saying what was it that we did spec in the past, and then start to take a hard look at that and realize probably fairly quickly that there was forced labor as part of previous projects. Therefore, not enabling us to sign a contract saying that there would be none in the future. I think where you've been shows where you will be going.
Okay, all right, go ahead, Counselor.
Yeah, so I think the other piece here, though, is that, I understand the perspective from the client to want to have assurances at some level. But I think there also, if you're going to have that, then you also need provisions that say, well, what happens if I do discover it? And my first step then is not to protect my client, is not to ask the contract and go find somebody else to design this building, but to say, how do we resolve the forced labor that we find?
Okay, so Randy, the contract negotiations are not going well. Sorry? I'm sorry, Sean, sorry. It's fine. Sorry, Sean. The contract negotiations are still not going well. The government's willing to back off, and they're going to say the design team will use your tool, and they promise to use any information they get from your tool to reduce forced labor in the project. But we're going to hold you responsible also, so.
put that in the contract. I think the thing that would be most on my mind would be ensuring that all these suppliers, no matter where they are in the tiers of the supply chain, are not just allowed to come up with their own plan, right? And it would have to be a kind of an impact-based approach, kind of what I was saying before, where those that have some leverage over them, whether it's EME or anybody else, are asking for real kind of due diligence efforts, not just kind of the usual thing that they do, against particular performance metrics, right? Like some of those things that I mentioned. What are the actual housing standards? What's interesting about the FAR compared to some other things, other regulations, is it has specific prohibited practices, which is different than just fight forced labor or tell us about transparency. And so those things actually can and should be linked to particular outcomes, particular types of proof.
So it's performance-based.
It's performance-based, right. Yeah. And so, but the key thing is who has the onus for responsibility for that? Are you not just getting information from a worker that says, yes, I paid fees, but are you getting the employer to prove that they paid for the...
We have a Jacob Rydell-style architect with a new definition of health, safety, and welfare. Meanwhile, we have a guest interlocutor. Bill, the speaker from tonight, has a question or a comment.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
I also just want to, because I'm not sure I want to make sure I'm doing justice. Like, there wasn't time to talk about, like, the contractors and the compliance plan that has to be developed and all of the components of it, the employee awareness program, the grievance mechanism, the recruitment wage plan, the housing plan. So I feel like we're giving short shrift to some of the safeguards and the mechanisms that are built in.
Okay, fair enough. Billy?
So I'm so glad you mentioned that, because it's clearly, I love the simulation. This is super exciting. I could do this for another 2 hours, right?
Speak for yourself. Or another 10 minutes.
I'll do it for the next 2 hours. Okay. So contractor, labor brokers are at the table, right? Clearly not represented. But the way I could see this going, I'm wondering, would the lawyer allow the architect or the design team with OBO to enter into a pilot program? Because that's usually what ends up happening. Is that, well, we can't guarantee something, we can pilot an approach.
So we're not doing the entire London Embassy, we're doing the tennis court? What's the...
No, we would do the entire London Embassy.
We're doing one job.
Yeah, we put a test in place, because I think that's actually what OBO has the capacity to do, is to test certain practices in the buildings that they're doing to look ahead to near future practices that are going to come aboard. So I know this isn't what you wanted, Phil.
No, it's not what I was going for.
But this is pragmatism.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, okay.
Well, I don't want pragmatism.
I know. And maybe limited it instead of every single piece of material that goes into the sentencing, maybe do something like the Kampala project, but we're looking at 10 products. Some of the earlier efforts we tried on the Congo project is to, this project was already awarded to a DB contractor, and so when the whole pilot came to my desk, I was really hoping to implement this given where this embassy is located. But because this project was already designed and awarded to the DB contractor, we were trying to ask them to just provide us with the information of identifying 10 materials, and out of those 10 materials, how many of them would be at risk, and then to propose what viable solutions would be for materials that are not at risk and how that would impact us from schedule and cost perspective. This is where we essentially received the pushback and heard that we really should start working on a project that's still in design, which I think is a great opportunity still. Yeah, I think it's still a great opportunity to maybe not look at it as a whole, maybe it will be a little less scary. We look at it from just 10 materials perspective, and we give you some sort of flexibility in giving us alternatives for materials that may become identified as at risk.
Yeah, it strikes me, we've for probably a decade or more been involved in rewriting specifications to incorporate sustainable performance criteria encompassing both environmental and material health. But it seems to me that in crafting Division 1 specs around not so much perhaps performance targets, but also remediative procedures. I think it would be great to get a couple of folks, Sean and others here, to draft some Division 1 spec language that would help inform how these contracts actually play out.
So I've got and I think that Ryan's intervention really points up to this. And I think that anybody that's worked with OBO knows that they very much have an open door. These are diplomats as well as architects. And so that idea of like, how do we get to something that is going to move the ball forward as to compliance with something that is required by the law, but such that those of you, the firms who want to continue to do business with the government will be able to get their lawyers to sign off on it, and not put you in a position where you have to make that decision to stop doing business with the government. That is the carrot and stick at that point, right? Because I think that you end up having the doing business with the government, especially on prestige projects like an embassy, is something that has enough value that it might make a actor choose to do some things that they might not do if it was a purely commercial client. Yeah. And I think that that's one of the things that we always have to look at. I think that there's one other thing I don't want to, when I was ambassador, Amy and Allison Friedman, my deputy, and Laura Rumlett, one of my other deputies, came into my office and said, we are putting you on an idea moratorium. And I was literally on an idea moratorium for 6 weeks. That was very nice of them. They gave me 6 weeks. But that was a while ago, so I'm with all apologies. The difference is that now this is just a suggestion. But I remember Ambassador Orrick, Bruce Orrick, who was at MC, I want to say he was in Reykjavik, who was the chairman of our, they actually called it the League of Green Embassies, which, if anybody had ever knew Bruce Orrick, he was like shaved head, totally buff, dark tan, and like a giant earring in his ear. And he looked like, I'm not sure if it was a pirate or Mr. Clean. But what happened is because he was kind of a larger than life ambassador. A lot of folks then were like, yeah, I want to be in that League of Green Embassies. And I think a lot of people didn't even know what it was. And he was the lead for the ambassador. And he did a really good job of socializing that. This is 15 years ago, so it was still being socialized. And I think that he ended up being able to not only put pressure, social pressure onto his other ambassadors who started saying, well, I want one of those, even if it's just a new conference room. And then that put pressure internally on OBO, who was then going and putting pressure on folks. Now I know that LEED is something that a number of the companies in the architectural firms are already familiar with. But that idea of, is it time to be thinking about a league of anti-slavery ambassadors? We know that there's always people every year who are leading on the tip report, who are out there meeting with victims, who are going to shelters, who have made it their priority for the years that they're out post. But it could be one of the other asks is like, okay, let's recapture that lightning in a bottle that Bruce Orrick ended up representing in his years over in Finland. Right. Maybe that's one of the ways. That's not a tasker for my old office, but it's like, it's one of the ways that you can, kind of get another lever to come to bear.
But, there is a kind of opposite question that I want to ask that's on the other side of that continuum. And this is something Ted and I have been talking about, which is, in one sense, you guys have this integrated delivery strategy, but I understand one of the results of that is that there are only 2 qualified contractors in the world that can now build U.S. embassies. That kind of releases competitive pressure and reduces your leverage tremendously, irrespective of what Mr. Clean, the ambassador, wants them to do. So how are you guys going to deal with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think I can answer that, in all honesty.
Anybody out there want to get into the embassy construction business? Ted, anybody talk about this?
regretfully.
Yes. Coach, this is Ted Brady, who's from the OBO, who's also one of our graduates, and is teaching a studio this semester on MC design.
We're aware that our limited pool of contractors that have footprints large enough in different markets around the world to be effective is a vulnerability for us. It removes competition. It makes it more difficult to manage the contractors because they know they have less competition. And we have been actively trying to expand that. Any contractors here that want to work with OBO, we'd love to talk to you. But those are the big things, is do you have a footprint in certain parts of the world where we can actually be effective working with you? And two, can they fit our system of delivery? And it's a hybrid of what we know in private practice.
So we're trying to embassies are being built.
Well, we have a 6-year spend plan, and over the next 6 years, I believe I want to say that we have 28, I think, that are planned over the next 6 years. Plus we have, we're in 293 countries, that's 293 embassies. We're on 5 continents, about to be on 6 continents. I'll let you figure out where the 6th one is. We've got 1,500 consulates. We have 80,000 housing units around the globe, and we have every typology of support facility in between those big typologies. So we have a lot going on.
This Congress is still supporting us?
They are. They're cutting us like they're cutting everybody. And so we're being tasked with doing more with less, which is not always easy, but it's also spawning a lot of innovation for us. I know that sounds strange, but we're talking about a government entity. But I have to say, OBO is a pretty inventive bureau. And we're looking at alternative methods of construction. We're looking at alternative materials, some of which is being driven by things like this. We're looking at everything you could possibly imagine to cut costs and durations.
Okay, I was just about to ask if you guys had the energy for a question. So,
thank you. Not a question, but just some points about the federal acquisition regulation to combat trafficking in persons. So I'm the resident bureaucrat if you have any questions about this regulation. And I think we all acknowledge after today's great discussions that there's great challenge in implementing these regulations and our shared goals. But the policy is quite strong, and I'm happy to share copies of it, or you can look up the FAR 2217 policy or the contract clause 52.222-50 for your awareness. There's a lot of good language there, and that language came from not just U.S. government actors, but civil society and corporate stakeholders to provide input in creating this language years ago, and it's been strengthened over time. And so within, I would like to cite some language from the policy. So we're not just asking contractors to say, no, there's no forced labor. We want them to say that after conducting due diligence, to the best of the offerer's knowledge and belief, neither it nor any of its agents, proposed subcontractors or their agents, has engaged in the activities. And if the abuse is related to any of the prohibited activities identified in 52.222-50B have been found, the offerer or proposed subcontractor has taken the appropriate remedial and referral actions. So we would like contractors to work together with us, and if we see that they have already developed a strong compliance plan, together with the contracting officer, together with the team, and of course there's coordination and cooperation throughout the contract, these won't be surprises. We'll be looking at this together. And so I encourage you to look at the language, and if we can take the lessons learned in that language and make it even stronger and apply it to this field, that's why we're all here. And that's great. Thank you.
Thanks. Melissa.
I'm sorry, I forgot your name. This might be directed to you, but also anyone else working in these kinds of issues. Kind
kind of a two-part question. In this due diligence or in these processes, are the contractors expected or required to include community input, but also not just in the building, but in the procurement of land? It's often understood they're in the more marginalized communities where land is cheaper, or in some countries not accessible to those people, right? They're in the bigger cities and stuff. So is there any community input in that in the entire process? Thank you.
Who wants to take that? Anna, is that you?
Sure, I'll take a swipe at it. I mean, currently, the short answer is no. But that is because a lot of the countries that we're in, that we're building in, that we have construction projects either actively going or being planned, are in countries where it is very difficult for us to have access to the communities. And why that is a series of things. I can talk very specifically about a place like Bangui in the Central African Republic, which is a landlocked country, obviously in Central Africa. We don't have a very good history with that part of the world, for obvious reasons, part of which we're here today to try and look at. And so getting things that are impactful, there's a lot of pressures on these projects that are impactful pieces of the pie that are not necessarily directly construction related. Things like visas, things like classified containers, things like overland shipping through warlord-torn Western Africa to get to Bangui, these kinds of things like that. And we're actively trying to work with a government that is not necessarily, one, hospitable, or two, stable in that. So they might make an agreement with us to help us do some of these things. And then a year later, we're dealing with a completely different situation. So being able to include the community, while we would like to, we want to, is oftentimes very difficult for these other reasons.
Okay, gang, it's 5:20. I say we call it. Thank you very much to our panelists and to everyone who is here. Okay, I want to tell you a little bit about tonight and then tomorrow. So tonight at 6:30, back in this room, because I know you love it, Professor Faircloth will be giving a talk as the keynote speaker of the symposium, which will be here at 6:30. And then we'll have a reception up in the gallery after Billy's talk, up in the second floor gallery. Tomorrow, the idea is rather than more people talking at you, we're going to divide up into some work groups, and there are 7 topics related to this issue that we've identified, ranging from policy through project delivery through technology. Each of the groups has been assigned a facilitator and a student helper. And what I'd like you to do, if you wouldn't mind, is there are sign-up sheets pinned up on the bulletin board as you come out of Hastings here on the left. Just put your name on the group that you're interested in, and then we will convene here tomorrow morning at 9:45 for instructions, and then folks are going to break out into work groups for about an hour, and then we'll reconvene to kind of show the ideas that we've come up with, rather than now that you've had a day of edification, you're going to get to do some work and come up with some new ideas around this topic. So we'll see everybody at 6:30 here back in Hastings, and thank you everybody for a great day.